Yeah, brief hiatus. So Exodus 26 and 27. This is part one. We're going to split this up into two because I want to look at it in different ways, both of these chapters. So today, it's more about the theological messaging of the instructions for the tabernacle. And you say, what in the world? Like, where's the theology in that? Well, that's the whole purpose of the episode. And then next time, part two, I want to devote an episode to I guess it's so, I could call it a controversy, but the disagreement, something I actually raised in Unseen Realm, the notion of what happened to the tabernacle. If you recall, those of you who have read Unseen Realm, and if you haven't, shame on you, get the book for Christmas. But there's a little bit in the book about how a scholar named Richard Elliott Friedman had hypothesized that the tabernacle tent structure itself was actually moved inside the temple complex. And actually, he based that on a few different verses and his understanding of how the tabernacle was constructed, the dimensions. And there are other scholars, and I think it's fair to say a majority of scholars, don't like that. There's one or two that just really, kind of hate Friedman's idea. And then there are others that are like, well, yeah, it's kind of workable, but we're not sure how well it's defensible. So I want to devote an episode to that issue because we're here in Exodus and tabernacle instructions. But for today, we want to hit the theological messaging. Now, to sort of start off here, scholars have noticed before plenty of times that Exodus 25:8, so the prior chapter, is actually a key verse that frames the tabernacle instructions and, of course, its later construction when this is all actually put into action. And that verse says, "Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst." Now, the verb translated dwell in that translation, which was ESV, is shakan. It's the verb equivalent of the noun mishkan, tabernacle. And so God wants a place to tabernacle with his people. And each Israelite had his or her own tent, and now God's going to get one. And it's this idea of God's presence returning to live among his people. Well, again, that should sound familiar, especially if you've read Unseen Realm and you're used to following biblical theological trajectories from Genesis onward. That should sound familiar, the language there, and of course lots of other items in these chapters, Exodus 26 and 27, inform us that Eden is being kickstarted. Eden is being restored in some sense. It's, we're starting over with that. God is going to dwell among his people. He has redeemed the new family he created from Abraham after divorcing humanity at Babel. And of course, Abraham's lineage goes back to Adam. Heaven is returning to earth. Again, these are the big picture ideas that go with the tabernacle that we're going to drill down into. It even extends, though, to the decorations. The decorations of the tabernacle, the cosmic garden motifs we've already talked about to this point. Again, the cherubim, the menorah, all this sort of stuff make this, give it this Edenic flavor. Okay, God is going to be with his family, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, and from them, he will proceed to propel the plan to reclaim the nations in the world, as was the case with the Edenic mission. This was the whole point. As with Eden, God will occupy sacred space. That's the purpose of the tabernacle, to mark off his space as being distinct from every other space, normal, mundane, profane. This is actually what the word profane means, ordinary space. And so he's going to share that space with the priesthood. When we get into the tabernacle chapters, he will, again, mark off turf. There'll be gradations of holiness. There's going to be a ritual system, which, if you go back and listen to the Leviticus series, you hear all about that. That's going to be installed to protect sacred space from defilement, and it's going to teach certain things about God, his otherness, his mercy, and above all, his desire to dwell among his human family. So in this episode, we're going to try to drill down on these two chapters, the instructions to sort of ferret out this kind of messaging. So I'm going to, I'm not going to read chapters 26 and 27. You can read them on your own, but it's basically just the set of instructions about do this, don't do that. here's what you use to build, here are the dimensions, that sort of thing. So it doesn't make for great, reading, make the loops this way, put them on the outer edge, not the inner edge, and all that sort of thing. But if you actually read through the chapters, you get references to colors, you get references to material. Of course, we've dealt with the furniture for the last couple episodes that we spent on Exodus, the ark, again, the lampstand, the bread of the presence. We're going to hit some other pieces of furniture. In chapter 27, there's the bronze altar, again, the outer court, oil for the lamp. So you get some of that in these two chapters, but I'm not going to rabbit trail on the furniture. We'll go back and pick up the altar that's mentioned here in the first few verses of chapter 27. We'll hit that when we hit chapter 30. We'll come back to that because of stuff going on in chapter 30. So for today, it's just about the instructions and sort of the look and the composition of the tabernacle. So I want to break it down really into a few sort of lead points. Again, just sort of ways that you can look at the instructions for the construction of the tabernacle and think about them. So the first one, I'm just going to call zones of the tabernacle, because we've mentioned this before, especially on the Leviticus series. But there are sort of zones of holiness within the tabernacle structure. There's an outer part, and you proceed inside to the Holy of Holies finally, and that's the most holy place. There are these zones where sacred space is thought of a bit differently than other parts of sacred space. So for lack of a better way to describe it, I'm just going to use the word zones. So zones of holiness, zones within the tabernacle. Now, there's an interesting article here that I'm going to put in the podcast article folder by Angel Manuel Rodriguez. It's entitled Sanctuary Theology in the Book of Exodus. This is published by, the journal is called Andrews University Seminary Studies. This is a Seventh-day Adventist journal. And as I've commented before, the Adventist tradition pays a lot of attention to sacrificial liturgy, tabernacle stuff. Again, it basically that is important for some of their theological trajectories. We're not going to defend Adventism for what it is as far as its teachings, but just to put the flag up here, that tradition spends a lot of time on Leviticus and liturgy and ritual and stuff like that. So this is actually a good source for thinking about the tabernacle itself. And Rodriguez, again, has some really interesting things to say. Let me just sort of telegraph that by reading part of the early part of his article. He says various investigators have noticed a parallel between God's appearance on the mountain, Mount Sinai, and God's manifestation in the sanctuary subsequently. So that sentence says, hey, there seems to be a relationship between the way the events on Sinai, at or on Sinai, are talked about, and the tabernacle, which again is something that you probably would never occur to you to think about. But again, this is why I'm dipping into Rodriguez's work. So back to him, he says, with respect to the experience at Sinai, as soon as the people arrived there, the Lord commanded them to get ready for the meeting with him. The Israelites were to consecrate themselves and to wash their garments. That's Exodus 19:10. On the third day, Moses was to bring them out of the camp to meet God. The people prepared themselves for the appointment, and on the morning of the third day, Mount Sinai was, quote, wrapped in smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, in verses 16 through 18. Now, although Yahweh and his people were to meet, the people themselves actually were not to have access to the mountain. Okay, and he quotes another verse in Exodus. You shall set bounds for the people round about, saying, take heed that you do not go up into the mountain or touch the border of it. Sinai, therefore, became holy because of God's presence, and it was fenced in so as to avoid any violation of its sanctity by the Israelites. An altar was also built at the foot of the mountain, Exodus 24:4, to which only certain young men selected by Moses from among the people could go to offer sacrifices. Access to the mountain itself was limited to Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel, again Exodus 24, who could go up a certain distance on the mountain only after the covenant had been ratified, Exodus 24:6-9. There they would worship the Lord from afar off and participate in the covenant meal. While there they saw the God of Israel. Again, Exodus 24, this is 9 through 12. Or perhaps more particularly, they saw the place where the Lord was standing, again, because his feet are mentioned. Moses alone could ascend all the way up the mountain near to Yahweh, where the glory of Yahweh was manifested in a special way. He went up there to get the tables of stone containing God's law. So, I mean, you have this, you can just read through that and you can kind of see that, okay, that there's gradations here. There's certain people only allowed in certain places. There's different things going on in different places in Sinai. And we can see that that's kind of like, the tabernacle sort of gets zoned off as well. Rodriguez adds this note. He says, the similarity of arrangement here with that of the subsequent tabernacle is striking. The fence around the mountain, with an altar at the foot of the mountain, would correspond to the court of the sanctuary with its altar of burnt offering. Again, it's the outer court. The limited group of people who could go up to a certain point on the mountain would correspond to the priests of the sanctuary who could enter into the first apartment or holy place. And the fact that only Moses could go up to the very presence of Yahweh would correspond to the activity of the high priest, who alone could enter into the presence of Yahweh in the inner apartment of the sanctuary or most holy place. The theological implications of these structural parallels should not be missed. First of all, as indicated above, the ancient Israelite tabernacle was to be a perpetuation of the Sinai experience. Now, I'm just going to stop there. I hope you get the point. You could sort of, if you were looking at a picture of a mountain, you could say, okay, at the base of the mountain, that corresponds to the outer part of the tabernacle. Then you go like halfway up the mountain, that's the inner portion, the holy place. And then the top of the mountain, again, where Moses was allowed, well, that's the Holy of Holies. I mean, you get these three sort of zones, three structural distinctions, areas on Sinai and in the tabernacle. And Rodriguez's point is that that's not an accident. This is intentional and part of the writer. We're supposed to think of the tabernacle because God's going to dwell there. He's going to, quote unquote, move from the mountain, and his presence is going to abide with Israel via the tabernacle, and most specifically the ark in the most holy place. So God's domicile, mountain, and now it's going to be this portable sanctuary. This is important. These parallels are deliberate because we've already talked about when it comes to the ark and the lampstand and the bread of the presence, how this is cosmic garden imagery. Well, it's actually also cosmic mountain imagery because of the way these zones parallel the experience at Sinai. And so Rodriguez's argument, and again, I think this has coherence to it, is that the Israelites, would notice this sort of thing, at least the literate ones, at least the ones, who had read this or knew about these gradations or remembered them in the early days before this was codified in Scripture. And they're going to be able to see, in transport at least, the decorative elements to the furniture inside the holy place and the Holy of Holies and whatnot, that this is going to be garden imagery. So they're going to be thinking God's mountain when they think about the tabernacle. And they're going to be thinking about God's garden, Eden, when they think about the tabernacle. Again, this is intentional, because of the whole cosmic garden, cosmic mountain thing, the motif that begins in Eden. Again, associated with the divine abode. This is ancient Near Eastern thinking. And if you've read Unseen Realm, this is all familiar to you. I'm not going to repeat Unseen Realm in the course of the podcast. As I've said many times, you need to go read the book to just get the full impact of these things. But you can sort of see how there's a conceptual continuity from Eden through Sinai, through the tabernacle, and ultimately through the temple. And when you get to the New Testament, lo and behold, there are things, really interesting things that happen in gardens or on mountains. And there's imagery, building imagery, especially temple imagery that gets applied to believers, who are inhabited by the glory of God, the same glory from the Old Testament and the Holy Spirit. I mean, all of these things are intentional. It's this continuity of thought. And here we are in the book of Exodus with something as boring as the tabernacle instructions and how it's constructed, how it's going to be used. And there you go. It's embedded in the layout of the thing. So again, it's just one thing to notice about these chapters. Now, number two, we could look at this a different way. There are parallels between the tabernacle instructions and, believe it or not, Genesis 1. Really Genesis 1 and 2, to be fair here. Now, this is also, again, I'll upload this article to the protected folder. Angel Manuel Rodriguez, again, different article. Genesis 1 and the building of the Israelite sanctuary. This is from a book source, or I think it's a book source, Biblical Research Institute General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists in 2002. So he's a contributor to this volume, and it's about parallels between the Israelite sanctuary and Genesis 1. Again, you don't have to be an Adventist, and I'm not, to appreciate this work. I mean, it's actually very interesting. Rodriguez, in this particular essay, acknowledges that this paper is an attempt to utilize the work of other scholars who have also seen parallels between the tabernacle and Genesis 1. So he's building on the work of others. For example, he draws attention to Frank Gorman's work, The Ideology of Ritual. Subtitle of that book is Space, Time, and Status in the Priestly Theology. And this is in the series Journal for the Study of the Old Testament Supplement Series, Volume 91, published in 1990 at Sheffield Academic Press. Now, Gorman, I have this book, and so I'm going to read some excerpts from this instead of Rodriguez's article, because Rodriguez alludes to this, but I think the meat of it is actually in Gorman's material. He writes this. In Exodus 25 to 31, Yahweh gives Moses instructions for constructing the tabernacle. 7 times the phrase, "and Yahweh said to Moses," occurs in these texts. Then he gives the verse references. The recurrence of this phrase serves to emphasize the divine origin of the instructions for the tabernacle. Kearney, okay, so this particular author, Gorman, is referring to the work of another man named Kearney. Kearney has argued that the 7 speeches by Yahweh in Exodus 25 through 31 correspond to the 7 speeches of creation in Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2 verse 4. The 7th speech, now listen to this. Again, this is literary analysis. Comparing, we got 7 speeches in Exodus 25 through 31, which is dealing with the tabernacle, and lo and behold, we've got 7 utterances by Yahweh in Genesis 1 and 2. So again, this is literary comparison. So back to Gorman here, he writes, again, quoting Kearney, he says, the 7th speech in both cases emphasized the holiness of the Sabbath. While not all of Kearney's arguments for correspondence are convincing, the attempt to relate cosmos, the creation, and cult, what happens in the tabernacle, is important. Cosmos provides the necessary context for correct enactment of ritual. Ritual only has meaning within a specific cosmos. Furthermore, these texts indicate that just as cosmos originated with Yahweh, he's the creator, so also the form of sacred space, of cult, originated with Yahweh. Again, the phrase, "and Yahweh said to Moses," plays an important structural role in these texts, excluding the introductory statement of Leviticus 1:1 and 2, and the concluding statement in Leviticus 7:37 to 38. The phrase also occurs 7 times in Leviticus, again, in the ritual text, in these speeches about the meaning of a particular sacrifice. So the first one's introductory, the second one is sort of summative. If you actually look about the instruction for the sacrifice, there are 7 of those. This series of 7 speeches giving instructions for proper activity in sacred space parallel the 7 speeches giving the instructions for constructing sacred space. That's the tabernacle, which in turn reflect the 7 acts of speech in construction of the cosmos, Genesis 1:1 through 2:4. That the priests understood sacrificial activity in the context of sacred space is clearly supported by the repeated emphasis that such activity is to take place, quote unquote, before Yahweh, before the Lord, at the door of the tent of meeting. And these are all from Leviticus, or at the altar of the door of the tent of meeting. Sacred activity is clearly oriented, again in Leviticus, by its being enacted in relation to sacred space. Thus, the tabernacle structure joins together the 2 ideas of Yahweh's presence in the midst of Israel and Israel's presence before the Lord in the sacrificial cult. Now, the work of Kearney he's referencing is an article, Creation and Liturgy. The P, he's a JEDP guy, the P redaction of Exodus 25 through 40. And that's in the German journal, it's the Zeitschrift für die Alte Testamentliche Wissenschaft, 89, in 1977. Again, the whole idea, let me summarize it this way. What these scholars are saying is there's a parallel in terms of the instruction, the verbal instruction, between the 7 speeches in Exodus, talk about the construction of the tabernacle, the 7 speeches of creation, and then if you go over and look at Leviticus as to how the tabernacle being constructed here in Exodus was used, and the meaning of the sacrifices, which if you go back to our series here in the podcast, to Leviticus, the sacrifices were not about the forgiveness of moral sin. They were about the purgation, the protection of sacred space from defilement, and the curing, the wiping away of defilement from the worshiper so that he would be fit for sacred space. It's all about sacred space. That's what the sacrificial system is about, and we often misunderstand it. So he's saying that there are these 7s, 7 speeches, 7 sets of instructions, 7 explanations for the meaning of the ritual that takes place on this sacred space. And again, these scholars are saying, look, that's just not coincidental. It's supposed to connect creation, the cosmos, with sacred space in the tabernacle and with the rituals that happen in the tabernacle. It connects these things. So to summarize it, I think more succinctly, I'm going to be selective because Rodriguez, in his article, when he getting away from Gorman now, which is one of Rodriguez's sources, he actually has a listing of these things. And I'm going to be selective here. I'm not going to go through all of them for the episode here to save a little time. But being selective, here are some examples that he notices. He says, you'll notice if you look at these parallel 7s, and just the passages themselves, you'll notice another pattern. There's 6 days plus a 7th day. So according to Exodus 24:15 through 17, he writes, Moses climbed Mount Sinai to receive instruction for the building of the sanctuary. Then he waited for 6 days, and on the 7th day the Lord spoke to him from the theophanic cloud. The sequence of 6 days and a 7th day is the same as we find in Genesis. It is uncertain whether the 7th day in this case was a Sabbath, though, but the reference to 6 and 7 days suggests a connection between the two narratives. In both cases, the 7th day provided the time during which there's a special meeting between God and humans. Another example, 7 divine speeches, which we've commented on before, just generally. God gave Moses instructions concerning the building of the sanctuary through 7 speeches introduced by the phrase, the Lord said to Moses. The 7th speech brings the instructions for the building of the sanctuary to a close with a call to keep the Sabbath. That's Exodus 31:13 and 17. In the creation narrative in Genesis, God spoke during 7 days and rested on the 7th day. It seems that it is that pattern that is being followed in the building of the tabernacle. Another example, linguistic parallels. Rodriguez just gives it this label. He says there are some terminological parallels between Genesis 1 and 2 and the building of the sanctuary. For example, letter A. God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis 1:31. Well, Moses saw all the work and the construction of the tabernacle, and behold, they had done it. Exodus 39 through 43. And what he's drawing attention to is that in Genesis 2, the first couple verses there, the same verb to say that everything was made, and then God's comment that it was very good. Moses approves of the construction of the tabernacle and uses the same verb for the completion. They had done it, they had made it in Exodus 39. So again, he's noticing that we've sort of got a bookending of this kind of verbiage. Genesis states that the heavens and earth were finished, Genesis 2:1 and 2, and again uses that same verb. After the building of the sanctuary, it's stated that all the work on the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was finished. Same verb as back in Genesis 2:1 and 2. So you get the idea, that there's the construction of the cosmos. God said it was, asah, they had made it. It's very good. And then if you go over to the tabernacle account, You have the same verbs show up once the tabernacle is completed and Moses approves of the project. He's satisfied. This is the way we were supposed to do it. Then another observation: God finished his creative work and blessed the seventh day, and Moses finished the tabernacle and he blesses the people in Exodus 39:43. There's a blessing pronounced. Again, I'm being selective here, but again, Rodriguez's article is full of this kind of stuff where one thing seems to mirror the other. Another one: during creation week, God separated light from darkness, water from water, day from night, so on and so forth. There's this verb of separation in Genesis 1 several times, verse 4, verse 6, verse 7, so on. After Genesis 1, the phrase between and to separate is used again in the setting of the tabernacle. So you have the same phrase, same verbiage used in the setting of the tabernacle. A veil was to separate the holy place from the most holy, Exodus 26:33. The priests were to separate or distinguish from or between the holy and the common, the clean and the unclean. The emphasis is on the fact that the Creator God is a God of order. And so, again, the cosmos is ordered, the tabernacle is ordered. What God's procedure, procedurally, when God is ordering the cosmos, he separates things. Well, procedurally, what happens in Leviticus and how the tabernacle is constructed results in separation of one thing from the other, distinguishing holy from the profane. And again, his argument is that the language here, the verbiage, is not coincidental. Another one, last one here for the sake of the episode: the presence of the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God is mentioned in both the creation narrative and in the construction of the tabernacle. Now, in Genesis 41:38, Pharaoh had used the phrase the Spirit of God or the gods, but obviously he's referring to his own deities. Therefore, if we wipe that one off the table, the next biblical reference to the Spirit of God after Genesis 1:1 is, guess where? Exodus 31:3, in the middle of the instructions for the tabernacle, or not in the middle, but right there in that section, Exodus 25-31. Of course, we're looking at two of those chapters specifically today. So again, Rodriguez is like, this isn't a coincidence. You go from Genesis 1, where actually it's 1:2, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. And the next time you see a specific reference to the Spirit of God is in this section when they're building the tabernacle. So he's like, okay, again, when we think of one thing, we're supposed to think of the other, and this is intentional on the part of the writer. God enables certain individuals to build the sanctuary by filling them with his Spirit. Those are the references. So you get Exodus 31:3, 35:31. It sort of ties the two things together by virtue of the language used. So, you could go through a bunch of these, and Rodriguez does in his article. There's a lot more to it than this, but it raises an obvious question. So what would the point be? What's the point of conceptually and psychologically linking the tabernacle to the Genesis creation? Well, again, Rodriguez would argue, just generally, I'm summarizing here, he would say that by doing this, the reader would see the tabernacle as the Creator's hand guiding the Israelites. In other words, just as God's hand was in creation, God's hand is in the construction of the tabernacle. God is there with them. He's guiding them through the Israelites, through his Spirit, to being a new creation. Again, and that's a familiar way of thinking about the Exodus, the deliverance from Egypt, the covenant at Sinai. We have a new creation here. So he's saying that's really what the writer wants the people to think about. So in addition to being the visible abode of God's presence, the tabernacle, therefore, also would be a visual emblem of order being brought out of the chaos of Egypt's bondage and the battle against her gods. It's a new creation. Third one, I'm going to add a third one here, and this is a bit. It'll feel a little bit off the radar, but we're going to go into this because, again, I think you're going to find it, quite interesting. Third way of looking at the tabernacle instructions is to think about the tabernacle, the possible relationship between the tabernacle and, believe it or not, the divine council. Now you're probably thinking, what in the world? Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you probably already have an inkling of the trajectory here. But if you haven't, this is going to sound like, what in the world? there's Mike. We've heard he has two heads, and this is proof. Well, again, go back and read Unseen Realm if you haven't. And for those of you who have, let's just jump in here a little bit. And again, I think you already kind of sense what's gonna happen here. So evangelicals typically think of the tabernacle only in terms of it being the place God met with Israel's leader, like Moses or high priest, or God never actually meets with the high priest, but that language is used of Moses and in theory his successors. Okay, that's typically how we think of the tabernacle. This is where God meets with Israel's leader, or on occasion, the people in a bigger, more corporate sense. When people are gathered, and God, the glory cloud descends, and so on and so forth. That's typically how we think of the tabernacle. It's God and the people, or God and the leader. Most, therefore, would be surprised that the tabernacle would give us anything to think about in regard to the divine council. The point of connection, though, is the fact that the tabernacle is a tent. Serious Old Testament scholars know that the high god of Ugaritic religion, El, lived in a tent. Consequently, they have taken note of this pretty obvious parallel as part of the wider discussion of how biblical writers in various places repurpose El language, the Canaanite El, Ugaritic El, how the biblical writers repurpose El language and El motifs for Yahweh. And of course, they do the same thing with Baal motifs, Baal phraseology, attributing that to Yahweh. Again, if this is totally unfamiliar to you, this is standard Old Testament scholarship. The biblical writers don't want their people to worship El and Baal. They are the regent and the co-regent of the heavenly host in Canaanite religion. Instead, they want to make the point that Yahweh is God, not these two dudes. And so they will use scenes from Canaanite literature and epithets, labels, titles of these deities and say, no, it isn't. Baal isn't the one who rides the clouds and gives us rain and keeps us alive. It's Yahweh. Yahweh is the one who rides upon the clouds. There are 4 references of that phraseology applied to Yahweh in the Old Testament. So this is what they're doing. And biblical writers do this a lot. They repurpose El and Baal, again, motifs, imagery, phraseology, whatever epithets, and they attribute it to Yahweh to teach theology, to teach who the real God is behind whatever thing that El or Baal is getting credited for. Well, if you realize that this happens, and it happens a lot in the Old Testament, you have to also be struck by the fact that El lives in a tent, and Yahweh is in a tent because we have the tabernacle. So we can't really ignore that. So back into the Ugaritic material here, more specifically, El lived in a tent on the cosmic mountain. The tent on the mountain was located at the source of the cosmic waters. Hence, El's abode was a well-watered garden mountain and happened to be in a tent. Now, again, the well-watered garden mountain, that's Eden. It's very obvious from the description of Eden in Genesis 2. The fact that Eden is referred to as the mountain of God in Exodus or Ezekiel 28. Again, this is all familiar territory for Unseen Realm readers. But now we're adding the tent element. Now, I'm going to quote a few lines from the Ugaritic text here. This is from Nicholas Wyatt's translation in the book Religious Texts from Ugarit, specifically KTU 1.4, point Roman numeral 4, lines 20 through 26. It's part of a council scene. And it's dealing with Anat meeting with El, or going to see El. So it says this: Then indeed she, Anat, set her face towards El at the source of the 2 rivers, or the source of the rivers. At the midst of the springs of the 2 deeps, she rolled back the tent of El and came to the pavilion of the king, the father of the bright one, or the shining one. At the feet of El she bowed and fell down. She paid him homage and honored him. So I'm quoting that again to give you the source material for the double deep, where El abides. He's in the source of the well-watered. It's a garden in the scene. It's on a mountain, and of course the reference to the tent there. So this is, again, the stock description of Canaanite religion's, high deity, El. Now, as Richard Clifford points out in his article, now Clifford should be a name that's familiar to this audience. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, and if you've looked at the footnotes, Richard Clifford is the guy who wrote, this is part of the Harvard Semitic Monograph series, The Cosmic Mountain in the Old Testament. It has since been reprinted as a paperback, so it's affordable. But he's the guy who did his dissertation on the Cosmic Mountain at Harvard and got it published. Well, he has an article as well. This was published in Catholic Biblical Quarterly in 1971, and it's entitled The Tent of El and the Israelite Tent of Meeting. Again, so he's zeroing in on this one aspect of how God is portrayed in the Old Testament. According to what Clifford notes in his article, the assembly of El, his council, also lived in tents and tabernacles. And he quotes, KTU 1.15, Roman numeral 3, column 3, line 15, which says this: in the convocation of the assembly of Ditan or Ditanu, and it's a reference to these other members of the spiritual world. Their last one I shall treat as the firstborn. The gods blessed him and went away. The gods went away to their tents. The family of El went away to their dwellings. So again, it's a very clear reference to the sons of God in Canaanite Ugaritic religion. They live in tents, so on and so forth. So the thing to note here, Ugaritic is not only a Semitic language, it is the closest linguistic relative to Biblical Hebrew. And the terms here for tents and tabernacles, or tents and dwellings in the translation that Clifford offers us, are the same terms that lie that are found in the Hebrew Bible that are translated tents and tabernacles. There is, biblical Hebrew word for tent is ohel. That's aleph, hey, lamed, the noun. And then you've got the reference to the tabernacle, mishkan. It's M, and then the SH consonant, shin, kaf, nun. It's exactly the same in the Ugaritic text that I just read. Tents and tabernacles. The gods went away to their tents, the family of El to their tabernacles. So it's a very obvious parallel, but the point to see here is there's not just one. El's council, again, also is described this way. And Clifford, in his article, says, although there's no explicit proof for this, there's no specific explicit lines in Ugaritic literature, he goes on to presume, and I think with some coherence here, that when El's council meets on his mountain, in his tent, that very obviously the sons of God are also in El's tent, because that's where they're meeting. Where else would they be? Again, he doesn't have a line from an Ugaritic text that actually spells out, how many deities are in the room, how many, council members are in the room. But he's like, look, this is logical. If this is where El lives, this is where his council meetings are held, and the other gods show up for the council meeting. Well, they're all there. They're all there in El's tent, in El's abode, so on and so forth. Now, one of the phrases, and for those who have read, again, either my InterVarsity Press, the dictionary article on the Divine Council, or maybe something in Faith Life Study Bible, one of the sidebars there, one of the Ugaritic terms for Divine Council meetings is read this way. It was called the Pukru Mo'idi, or, that sort of thing. It means, well, let me just take it apart. You've got two nouns there. You've got P and then a hard H. We call it H with a little curved thing underneath it, H with a smiley face, because Semitic has more than one H. You have to distinguish the sounds. And then the letter R. So P, H with smiley face, R, and then the word Mo'ed or Mo'idi. So M, Ryan, Dalet. You got two words there, phrase. The first of those words, the P, and again, the H with the smiley face, R, is drawn from Akkadian. It means assembly. The second, the Mem, the Ryan and Dalet word, means appointed gathering or appointed meeting. Together, the phrase means meeting of the divine assembly. Now, the second word is the one that has a direct biblical Hebrew equivalent. The first one does not, but if you've read Unseen Realm, when I talk about the Har Mored, Har is mountain, and then you have this Mem, Ryan, Dalet word. It's the Mount of Assembly. So that's what we're talking about here. In biblical Hebrew, it's the Har Mored, the Mount of Assembly, the mountain where the council meetings are held. And again, that matters in Isaiah 14 and a few other passages. And it's really what lurks behind the term Armageddon, Har Mageddon, the Har Mored, the Mount of Assembly. It's not the plains of Megiddo. It's a mountain It's a cosmic mountain. It's the place where the divine council meets, which in Israelite theology at that point, or at the point of the temple and onward, is Zion. So Armageddon is a battle that takes place for and at Zion, okay, Jerusalem, if you will. But again, you can go back and read Unseen Realm for that. What I'm talking about here is that you have this phrase that shows up in Ugaritic, and we have this Hebrew equivalent for the divine council, for the Mount of Assembly. Now, the implications of all this, again, ought to be obvious. We've got similar and in some cases identical terminology between these passages in the Hebrew Bible, specifically, the tents and the tabernacles in the Exodus section that we're talking about. We know it's sacred space. We know it's connected to the cosmic garden mountain, and we've got these overlap of ideas between the Hebrew Bible, Israelite, belief of the biblical writers, and Ugarit. Okay, that's all well and good, but I want you to focus on a specific point here, because we're talking about the tabernacle and the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. It's kind of interesting. Again, this is the way I'm going to say it. I can't prove it, but I think you can build a coherent argument for it, at least one that makes sense linguistically, and that I've just sketched out here. Scholars have wondered, since the Ugaritic Council met at El's abode, his cosmic garden mountain, and that his abode was a tent, they've wondered whether these phrases and their conceptual equivalent to the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting, what that might mean. The idea would be that when the glory cloud descended to meet with Moses, and recall sometimes Moses entered the cloud, like Exodus 24:18, that somehow that was the gateway to an undefinable alternative reality. It was a gateway to the spiritual world that included the divine council. In other words, they're all in the cloud. They're all in the cloud. Now, we know biblically, it says that the Lord was in the cloud. So there's the obstacle. There's the thing that makes it somewhat uncertain. So it's really hard to know whether we can read into some of these tent of meetings, not all of them, but some of them, these tent of meeting accounts, whether God's actually there with his counsel. You say, well, that just sounds kind of flaky. Like there's nothing like that in the Bible. Well, actually there is, and that's why this is an item for discussion. It is hard to know for sure in the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting passages, but there are passages that have the council with Yahweh on Sinai. There just are. You have Psalm 68:17. Okay, let me just read that. So the point is that Yahweh is on Sinai with others. Okay. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Sinai is in the sanctuary. And that's a quote from Psalm 68, which is about the mountain of God. It's actually about Hermon and Sinai, again, without rabbit trailing back into Unseen Realm again. But you've got God present, connected with Sinai, with his heavenly host. Deuteronomy 33:1-4. Again, specifically, you get more of this in the Septuagint. But this is the passage that the Lord came from Sinai and dawned upon Seir among us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came, the Septuagint will have with the 10,000s of holy ones. The entourage is with him. The heavenly host is there. Somehow, again, it's cosmic realm language. We shouldn't look at this and think, well, if I was there at Sinai, man, I should be able to see all those guys. Like you're counting, Elohim noses or something. No, this is the language of spiritual presence. Now, if you as a listener, if you're as a Christian, believe that there really are spiritual forces around you right now, can you see them? No, that has nothing to do with the theology. We're talking about the theology of this right now, that the spiritual world by definition can't be seen unless providentially you're allowed to see it. Okay? So could that idea that the divine council was present at the tent of meeting, at some of these, not all of them, but some of these passages, some of these situations, that you actually have everybody in the tent. It's a full tent, okay, in a manner of speaking. Is that possible? Well, I would say, given the fact that, just think about what we've been talking about. If we consider that the writer is deliberately trying to parallel Sinai with the tabernacle, there might be something to this. And consider as well God's instructions that the earthly tabernacle was to be modeled after a heavenly prototype. I mean, after all, God does say, hey, I'm giving you the heavenly pattern. Exodus 25:9, Exodus 25:40 say that specifically. See that you make all this stuff after the pattern for them, which is being shown you on the mountain, okay? I mean, we know this is part of the idea that what's being constructed here is an earthly counterpart, an earthly equivalent, an earthly, a mirror image, or however you want to describe it, to something in the spiritual world, to the heavens, okay? Considering that, there is something to think about. Now, it's hard to press the idea. It's hard to know exactly how far to take this or how to exactly think about it. The patterning, may simply speak of God giving directions as opposed to being, handing Moses blueprints. And again, but you couldn't hand Moses blueprints for a spiritual reality, could you? Because it doesn't have physical form. So let's not get hung up on the physicality of the description about the template and the pattern and the blueprints. And we, human writers, and we have to use this language because we live in a spatial world. We're embodied. We have to have physical language like this. So we can't dismiss the idea that the spiritual world in all its fullness, i.e. the heavenly host, the council, is actually present in some of these passages, like at the tent of meeting. We can't dismiss that based upon the language of, well, God gave Moses a template and he's building something you can see. Yeah, of course he's building something you can see because he's a person. He's human. He's embodied. But that doesn't mean the thing on the other side, as it were, should be parsed and thought about the same way. As I've said many times, when it comes to the afterlife, when it comes to what the agents of the heavenly host do, when it comes to what does God's house look like, his throne room, the entourage, the structure, the hierarchy, the order, we are forced to use the language of embodiment for a place that has no latitude and longitude. It is not spatial by definition. It's just the way it is. We can't describe something that we cannot even conceive of with language we don't have. And so the biblical writers use the language of spatiality and physicalness, if that's even a word, physicality. So we can't use that in one side to press literalism, too far in one direction. And we also can't use the fact that we have to use that language in a way to deny spiritual connections as well. That would be an inconsistent hermeneutic. And we try to be consistent here. Again, we try to be fair with the data and we try to be consistent here. So I do think there is something to think about here, given the way that the tabernacle instructions are designed in some way to make you think of Eden, to make you think of the creation, the presence of God, all of these things, the spiritual realities behind God's presence. What's being built here is supposed to make you think those thoughts very evidently. And all I'm suggesting here is that one of those thoughts might be that the divine counsel is actually in some of these scenes, even though you can't, quote unquote, see them. And they aren't specifically and explicitly mentioned. Because the logic would be, again, where God is, his entourage is. Where he meets, they are. Where else would they be? In some other spiritual world? No, again, there's just something to think about here because of this sort of template understanding of one thing to the other. So I wanted to throw that in because, again, the obvious point of connection is the tent language, and that's very overt. So to think about the implications of that, again, I think are well worth doing. And I think it's a good way to, make the assertion, make the claim. And I think, again, there's obviously merit to it. We just spent, a whole episode on it, that even something as transparently or seemingly boring as, hey, build the tabernacle, do it this way, here's what it's supposed to look like, and again, how the tabernacle's used, what it looks like when it's built, the different parts of it. The furniture is easier to get excited about because of the Ark of the Covenant and all that. Yeah, I get that. But just the tabernacle as a concept and as an item itself actually messages theology. It really does. So there's a lot to think about here and a lot to sort of notice in terms of the way that the biblical writer wants you to be thinking. This is why, as I've said in Unseen Realm and lots of other occasions many times, I want the Israelite living in your head, because what the biblical writers are doing is they're writing to people of their own day. They're not writing to you. They're not writing to me. They're writing to people of their own day, and they can make certain assumptions that when my readers read this, they're going to think about this other thing over here. And I want them to think about those two things in tandem because they are related. There are things that one teaches about the other and vice versa. They are supposed to be mentally, intellectually, theologically connected. That's why I'm doing it this way. And again, all of this, again, under providence, the inspiration of Scripture. Again, all of these things have a purpose. Even passages as ostensibly boring as this one. They have a purpose. They have a reason for being. And for me, I think it's kind of interesting.
Mike, how did we get the word tabernacle?
Well, we get it. It's actually sort of a literal understanding of a place to dwell. Mishkan, shakan is to dwell, to inhabit. So the shakan language gets associated with the Shekinah, the glory cloud later in Israelite thinking. And tabernacle in English was one of those words that was used to describe a dwelling place that isn't people occupied. It's a place of worship. It's a place of liturgy. That this kind of thing. So, I think I can't tell you the English etymology. I can tell you just conceptually why that kind of terminology was deemed appropriate. Just in terms to distinguish this dwelling place from other dwelling places.
We're wrapping up Exodus 26 and 27 this week.
Yeah, we are. Last time we talked about these two chapters. Here it was really about the theological messaging of the instructions and the construction of the tabernacle. So this time, though, I want to sort of dip into something that, is historical in orientation, but also a controversy. I alluded to this a bit in Unseen Realm in the chapter about the tabernacle and the temple and sacred space and whatnot. Today, to refresh people's memories of that, we're going to get into the whole question of, was the tabernacle, again, the tent structure, moved inside the temple once the latter was built? So this is sort of like what happened to the tabernacle, kind of episode. And this is actually, controversial. And I mentioned in Unseen Realm that a particular scholar, Richard Elliott Friedman, has articulated this idea in several publications. And it creates sort of a neat imagery where the big cherubim can be the throne of the Lord, and then the Lord's feet, as it were, metaphorically would rest on the ark, if this was the case, if it's moved inside and whatnot. So Friedman is the scholar who, put this forward really back in 1980. So this has been around for a while. And he published a book later. This is part of it. It actually works its way into his Who Wrote the Bible book, which was a big bestseller back in the day, which popularized the JEDP theory, the approach to the Pentateuch. It's popped up in other Anchor Bible Dictionary, which was published in 1992. He has the entry on tabernacle. So this has been out in a number of sources for a while, and many scholars consider it possible, but haven't really glommed onto the idea, largely because, this is going to sound weird, one of the major objections that scholars have to it is that if it's real, if it's true, then the tabernacle would have to be historical. Again, in the world of critical scholarship, scholars tend to believe that there was no tabernacle, just like there was no Exodus. There's no tabernacle. This is sort of a mythical story that people who were living during the era of the temple sort of take the temple and they retroject it back into Israel's earlier history, and they sort of make up this predecessor. That, since people are so married to that because of either how they date the presumed sources of the Pentateuch or just how they operate with this evolutionary perspective of Israelite religion, since they're married to this kind of thinking, they don't really like Friedman's proposal. Because if he's right, well, then there was a tabernacle and it gets moved in and to the temple and so on and so forth. Now, one particular scholar really hates the idea, and we're going to get to him as well. But in this episode, I want to summarize what Friedman is arguing for and really why, kind of what prompted it. And then we'll get into the guy who just hates it the most, Avigdor Horowitz, and see what criticisms he levels at it. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about like what happened to the tabernacle. Was it still around when the temple was here? Does it actually get moved in? And why would we even think that? Why would we even presume that? Because you would think, well, when they have the temple, they just get rid of the tabernacle. Who cares? We've been there, done that. Now we're on to this new thing. Again, there are certain things that prompted Friedman to wonder about that. So what I've done if you're a subscriber to the McLeod newsletter, you can get access to the protected folder. I've uploaded one of Friedman's publications, The Tabernacle in the Temple. This is from Biblical Archaeologists way back in 1980. And then when we get to Horowitz's response, I've also uploaded his article so you can get both sides of this. So Friedman's proposal. Let's just jump in there. His Biblical Archaeologist article begins this way. Okay, he says, in the September 1947 issue of Biblical Archaeologist, there appeared Frank Moore Cross's study, The Priestly Tabernacle, in which Cross challenged the prevailing Wellhausian view. So when you hear Wellhausen, think of the evolution of Israelite religion from polytheism to monotheism. So Cross challenged the prevailing Wellhausian view of the biblical tabernacle in the Wellhausian scheme. The portrayal of the tabernacle, which is the central place of worship for the Israelites in the wilderness, that this is fiction. That's Wellhausen's view. It's the product of the imagination of post-exilic priestly writers. Cross suggested, rather, that the priestly tabernacle account reflects a historical structure, the tent of David. The purpose of the present study is to pursue further the actual and portrayed history of the tabernacle, looking especially into the years subsequent to David, when Solomon's temple succeeded David's tent. It is argued here that the priestly tabernacle description does indeed reflect a historical pre-Solomon structure, which was placed in the temple and was located there until the destruction by the Babylonians. Let me just stop there. When Friedman is defending the historicity of the tabernacle, to him the quote-unquote original tabernacle was a tent that David made. All right? So let's keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to reference the original tabernacle as being something different. It's something that was actually real back in the days of the Exodus. Okay? So, original tabernacle, that phrase might mean something when it reflects me, or as opposed to Cross and then Friedman and what they're arguing for. But the point is that most scholars, just don't believe that there was a tent structure at all. And so they find Friedman's thesis either questionable, uncertain, or they just plain hate on it. So let's go back to Friedman. In the rest of his abstract, he says this: if a tabernacle shrine existed and was popularly and royally venerated until the construction and dedication of the temple, then one might well expect some textual indication of the fate of that shrine after the temple arose. The biblical histories do not report explicitly that the tent of meeting was brought up to the temple of Solomon on the day of the temple dedication, together with the ark and the sanctified vessels. And he references 1 Kings 8:4 here, which I will read. They brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. Now, that, again, looks like it does reference the tent of meeting, but you have to realize that there's a whole argument in scholarship about the tent of meeting being different than the tabernacle, and the tent of meeting being the tent, again, that David built, not Moses, because Moses, we don't even know if Moses was real or there was no Exodus. Okay, so they're going to be certain verses that to your ear will sound like they say one thing, but again, scholars are critical scholars, those who don't feel the need to, sort of have a high view of Scripture. They don't have a high view of Scripture and therefore don't see the need to affirm lots of things as being genuine. That's where the bulk of the world of biblical scholarship is. They're going to be thinking something different when they run into these verses. So back to Friedman's abstract. So you have this verse, 1 Kings 8:4, about what was brought up to the temple. And he says, this verse has, since Wellhausen, been regarded as a gloss, like just something added later, because of the infrequent references to the tabernacle in the history of the land prior to this report. So in other words, once Israel gets into the land in the biblical story, he's saying, since the tabernacle is really not referred to much, when it is, scholars tend to just say, oh, they're making that up. They're throwing that in, again, to retroject the temple back into earlier biblical history. So that's just how they look at it. So that's the end of Friedman's abstract. Now, just that bit, even though Friedman is obviously not in anything we would call the evangelical world, or the world of scholars who do assign historicity to an Exodus and the tabernacle in the days of Moses. Friedman's not there, but his sentiments run quite contrary to accepted dogma. Again, especially Wellhausen, whose research provided a religious rationale for JEDP in its classical formulation. And again, JEDP is the idea that the Pentateuch was totally not written by Moses. Again, typically they would say there was no real Moses. If there was, he didn't write anything. But rather that the Pentateuch, the Torah, was written much later, and it is a composite of source documents named JEDNP. So the documentary hypothesis. So, Friedman is a documentarian. He's just disagreeing with this part of this sort of the general consensus. And he does assign historicity to the tabernacle, at least the tent in the time of David. So we want to know who Friedman is. He's a critical scholar, but he's running against the grain here. Now, from this point, Friedman gets right into his thesis and its trajectory. So I'm going to read what he says, just lay it out for you. Here's his argument. Scholars generally have thought the dimensions of the tabernacle, that they comprise a reduced scale imitation of the Jerusalem temple. But these dimensions are by no reckoning proportionate to those of either the first or the second temple. In the standard estimates, the tabernacle, as described in the book of Exodus, is 30 cubits in length, 10 in width, and 10 in height. In my own calculation, he says, the tabernacle is 20 cubits in length. So there's a difference there. 8 in width and 10 in height. And he illustrates this in his article with pictures, how he gets to his dimensions. Because now this is important, because for it to fit inside the temple, it has to be 20 in length and 8 in width and 10 in height, not 30, 10, and 10. So he's going to argue how this can be done based on the description of the tabernacle in the book of Exodus. And he has his own way of laying out the language there so that the dimensions turn out this way. He says the first temple, as described in 1 Kings 6, is 60 cubits in length, 20 in width, and 30 in height. It is thus 3 times the height of the tabernacle, but twice its length and width. Suggestions of correspondence of the dimensions of the tabernacle with the second temple are groundless, as the dimensions of the second temple are not reported anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. According to Ezra 6:3, Cyrus had directed that the second temple be constructed 60 cubits in breadth, but there's no report concerning whether this direction was followed, and again, the tabernacle dimensions don't correspond. The measurements of the tabernacle correspond rather to those of the space inside the Holy of Holies in the first temple, beneath the wings of the cherubim. According to the description of the temple construction, 1 Kings 6, 2 Chronicles 3, the Holy of Holies, or the Devir, is 20 cubits in length, 20 cubits in width, and within are the 2 cherubim, each 10 cubits high. Their wings are spread, and the wing spread of each is 10 cubits, so that the tips of the wings of each touch the walls of the room on each side, and touch each other in the center of the room. I actually have a little picture of how he describes this in Unseen Realm. Thus the space between the cherubim is 10 cubits in height, 20 cubits in length, and less than 10 cubits in width, as the bodies of the cherubim take up a portion of the center space. The measurements of the tabernacle as pictured in Exodus 26 and 36 are just this 10 cubits in height, 20 cubits in length, and 8 cubits in width. Scholars until now have reckoned the tabernacle dimensions differently owing to the manner in which the tabernacle construction is portrayed in the book of Exodus. The exact measurements are never stated outright. One must rather derive them from the description of the materials and structure. So we'll end there. So what he's going to say is, like, look, we get these instructions, but we're never really told, again, precisely, how it, what the size is once it's constructed and so on and so forth, and so he's going to take that plus this space within the later temple, and he's going to argue that he can align them, he can match them so that the tent structure will fit inside the temple. And now there's a reason why he's doing this. There's a reason why he feels that this is important. I mean, you can, as far as the construction, what it would look like, and how he puts things together, you can reference the article and look at the pictures. You have to ask, why does he care? Is he just like fixated with measurements? And, is this guy an engineer or a carpenter, in his other life? No, he appeals to certain passages in the Old Testament to justify the idea, just basically to justify the whole question and the whole endeavor. What he's really trying to do is to make certain statements in certain passages make sense. For example, there's a controversy naturally over whether the actual Old Testament tabernacle was still around in David's time, or whether David made a new tent for the ark. Again, I've mentioned that division before. And again, a lot of scholars don't believe that either of those is historical. But for those that would think the tabernacle is historical, most of them are going to land with this tent that David makes, because there are references to David making a tent to house the Ark of the Covenant. Now, 1 Chronicles 16, 1 through 6, and verses 37 to 38 seem to suggest that there might be two tents. Now, to understand those verses, though, we have to look at some other ones first, earlier than the Chronicles reference. So let's look at 2 Samuel 5, 8 through 11. We're just going to read a few passages and just kind of notice some things in them. So 2 Samuel 5, 8 through 11 says this. I'm reading ESV. David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. This is the incident when the ark, he reaches out his hand to steady the ark so it doesn't fall off the cart, and God strikes Uzzah dead, for touching the ark. So David's upset. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Next chapter in 2 Samuel, this is 2 Samuel 6, 16, and 17. This is the short encounter, or the short account of the ark being brought to Jerusalem. We read this. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. She despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. Now, the question is, how could the ark, apparently the ark in 2 Samuel 5 didn't have a home. It's outside the tabernacle, and so David's going to take it, to Jerusalem, but then the Uzzah thing happens, and so they leave it at the house of Obed-Edom. He puts it somewhere for 3 months, and then David goes and gets it out, and he puts it in a tent that he had pitched for it. So there is evidence, again, that David, has made a tent, for the ark. Now let's go back to 1 Chronicles 16, 1 through 6, and read that. This is, again, similar, the Chronicles version of what's going on here. They brought in the ark of God and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And they offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before God. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord and distributed to all Israel, both men and women, to each a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, a cake of raisins, so on and so forth. Then he appointed some of the Levites as ministers before the ark of the Lord to invoke, to thank, and to praise the Lord, the God of Israel. Asaph was the chief. Second to him was Zechariah, Jael, Shemiramoth, Jehiel, Mattithiah, Eliab, Benaiah, Obed-Edom, and Jael, who were to play harps and lyres. Asaph was to sound the cymbals, and Benaiah and Yahaziel, the priests, were to blow trumpets regularly before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. So that's the first 6 verses. You go down to verses 37 and 38, we read this. So David left Asaph and his brothers there before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to minister regularly before the Ark as each day required. And as Obed-Edom and his 68 brothers, while Obed-Edom, the son of Jeduthun, and Hosa were to be gatekeepers. Now, you look at that. Before the ark, they're ministering before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to minister regularly before the ark as each day required. Friedman is going to seize on that and say, there were required elements of service before the ark that are described in earlier portions of the Hebrew Bible, where it seems like the tabernacle structure itself is required. Like the structure itself has some sort of role to play in some of the rituals. And so he's like, okay, if they're doing this, if we take this seriously, that they're ministering regularly before the ark as each day required, then it seems like the original quote-unquote tabernacle is there, or maybe this is how we should read, this wording that David builds the tent, and then that sort of becomes what later scripture, or other scripture calls the tabernacle, or you've got 2 tents. So there's something going on here. There's a tent that David builds. Is it the same as the one that the Bible elsewhere calls the tabernacle? Now, again, those who think that the Mosaic tabernacle was real and historical would say, well, maybe David did build a tent. Maybe there was a temporary structure somewhere in Jerusalem for the ark. But if you're going to do this ministry, that implies that the tabernacle has to be used. And maybe this tent that David built, maybe it's just David commanding that the original tabernacle be set up, whereas earlier it wasn't. So you have this controversy. And I don't want to get too lost in the tent during the time of David, but it's part of this discussion. Because again, all Friedman is arguing is that, look, there was something going on here that was real, it was historical. Whether David is setting up the Mosaic tabernacle, and that's what the language means about the tent that David had pitched for it, or whether, well, that never really happened, but David himself did actually build a tent in which the ark was kept. Either way, okay, what Friedman is arguing is that whatever that was, and whoever built it, is going to get inserted into the temple. And so we need to sort of figure out what's going on here. Now, there are some verses that suggest a tent is associated with the temple. And this is what sets Friedman off on this trajectory, on this run. So there's this notion that after the temple was built, there's still tent language associated with Solomon's temple. And Friedman's like, look, the only way that can make sense is if this tent structure, again, whether it was David that built it or whether he just reset up the original Mosaic tabernacle, he's going to say we don't know that. But whatever it was, that thing gets moved into the temple complex because there are certain verses that just associate the Temple of Solomon with a tent, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless this other thing is real. So let's take a look at some of these passages that sort of set Friedman off, and this will kind of explain why he cares. So let's go to 2 Samuel 7, verses 1 through 6. Now listen to this carefully. This is the Davidic covenant when David has the idea to build a temple, and then God's going to make a covenant with him, and so on and so forth. Now when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." Now this isn't the word mishkan here, so we need to be thinking about vocabulary. Mishkan is the biblical Hebrew word for tabernacle. So hold on to that. This isn't that word in particular. It's a different word, but let me just look it up here, and I'll get it to you. The ark of God dwells in a tent. The wording here, again, is not mishkan. It's actually sort of a verb for tent dwelling, or you have a verb here, yashav, again, to sit or to dwell, and then you have within, and then you have a word for a tent structure that isn't mishkan. So you've got an idiomatic phrase here. The ark of God dwells in a tent. And this bothers David. Like, why should I have this nice house? And look at where the ark is. So Nathan said to the king, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? Now catch this next verse. I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent. Now, this word here is ohel. That's the Hebrew word for tent. It's not mishkan, which is the term used for the structure of the tabernacle. God says, I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. Now, how do we take that? It raises a number of questions, because in Exodus 26, verse 7, you shall also make curtains of goat's hair for a tent over the tabernacle. 11 curtains you shall make. We do get the word ohel for the curtain that was draped over the mishkan, over the tabernacle structure. So we have to realize that the tent itself is not the tabernacle. I mean, that might sound a little odd, but it's not. Because when we say the word tabernacle, we visualize a tent structure. But there are actually different terms here. The structure, the frame of what is the tabernacle, that's what's called mishkan, and it's draped over with a tent, the ohel. So there's actually two parts that make up the whole. And so that's important. It makes it coherent that you could have, when the word ohel is used, you could actually have a reference to the tabernacle structure, because the ohel is the word used for the cloth that draped over the mishkan in the time of Moses, in the books of Moses, in the book of Exodus. So it's the tent component of the overall structure. So when God says, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. In other words, I've never had a house, but I have been moving about in a tent. Even though the word is ohel, this can still reference the tabernacle, because the ohel is the cloth draped over the structure known as the tabernacle. So this verse could be understood to say, you know what, Nathan, I've come to you in a dream. I heard the other day that David has a desire to build me a house, and I'm still living in the tabernacle here, and it's been fine. That would, again, if you look at the verse that way, that implies that the tabernacle's still standing. It's still used. It's still around. And this is 2 Samuel. Again, this is the time of David. And so you could take this passage, that line, what God says to Nathan in the dream, and say, well, if that's the case, then maybe the tent that David pitches for the ark is actually the real tabernacle that he has just, maybe it was disassembled, or it was somewhere else and then it has to be taken apart, and then David, erects it again for the ark, so that it's nearby. It could be the same thing, and not just some other tent that David makes, like implying that the tabernacle is, so to speak, history. Like they don't use it anymore, or it got destroyed, or it just wore out, or whatever. And then David said, well, we need a tent to cover the thing, so let's do that. It could actually be, again, the Mosaic structure. So with that, we'll keep that in mind. Again, this is the time of David now, where we have a very possible reference to the tabernacle. So another passage that kind of, leads us to wonder or presume that the original tabernacle is still around is 1 Chronicles 7:5. Go and tell my servant David, and this is the Chronicles version of the 2 Samuel 7 passage. Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, it is not you who will build me a house to dwell in, for I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up Israel to this day, but I have gone from, and here this is going to sound odd, I have gone from tent to tent, and from dwelling to dwelling. And the word dwelling there is mishkan, tabernacle, and the tent to tent is ohel. Now we actually have a textual difficulty here, because if you look at that in English, it seems like, well, the original tent of Moses, that probably wore out and they had to make another one. I've gone from tent to tent, upgrade, remodel, whatever it is, and from tabernacle to tabernacle. Again, that's technically, let me just approach it this way. The Septuagint does not have that. So there's a textual issue here. The Septuagint actually says, I have gone from being in the tent and in the tabernacle. Okay. In other words, God says, I haven't lived in a house since I brought Israel up, but I have gone about, I've been around, gone about in the tent and in the tabernacle. So if you take it that way, you don't have upgrades. You don't have the original tabernacle wearing out. You don't have any of that. So which text is the right one? And again, scholars disagree, with this. Like how do we take this? And of course, Friedman's like, look, I'm going to go with the Septuagint. Whatever this is, again, whether it's just a sort of a retrojection in David's day or something, some reference to something older, it proves the passage is consistent with 2 Samuel 7 that there is a tent structure still around or being used for the ark. And that's important to Friedman because now we're going to go to passages that, again, associate the temple itself with some kind of tent, which is really, again, odd to our ear. 1 Chronicles 9, 17 through 19. This whole passage is a list of people returning from exile. So this is like way removed from David. People returning from exile. But the issue in the passage for us is how the lost past temple, now the temple's been destroyed, okay? The lost past temple gets referred to. So situate yourself mentally. This is after the exile. Temple has been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. People are coming back. And then we get this list of people. And it turns out in this list, there's actual temple personnel, that families, again, historically, whose families had been servants, in the temple. And we read this. The gatekeepers were Shallum, Akub, Talmon, Ahiman, and their kinsmen. Shallum was the chief. Until then, they were in the king's gate on the east side as the gatekeepers of the camps of the Levites. Shallum, the son of Korah, son of Eviasaph, son of Korah, and his kinsmen of his father's house, the Korahites, were in charge of the work of the service. Keepers, catch this. These were temple servants, and here's how they're described. This family had been keepers of the thresholds of the tent. Like what's that? And then you go down to verse 21. Zechariah, the son of Meshelemiah, was gatekeeper, quote, at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Now this is post-exilic, and this is a list of families who had been temple servants, but they're described as keepers of the thresholds of the tent and working at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Like, what's going on with that? It's the temple, right? Why are we making it sound like a tent? Another one, 2 Chronicles 29, 3 through 7. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. This is a reference to the time of Hezekiah, which again is after Solomon. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. He brought in the priests and the Levites and assembled them in the square on the east and said to them, Hear me, Levites. Now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers, and carry out the filth from the holy place. Okay, so he opens the doors of the house of the Lord. Sounds very temple-ish, okay? And he says, now consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord. Let's clean it up. Carry out the filth from the holy place. For our fathers have been unfaithful and have done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They have forsaken him and have turned, catch this, they have turned away their faces from the Mishkan, the habitation, the ESV says. See, it's interesting that the ESV translator won't use the English word tabernacle here, because the tabernacle is not supposed to be around anymore. This is the temple. But the same word used of tabernacle over and over and over and over again in the Torah is right there. They have turned their faces from the Mishkan of the Lord and turned their backs. They also shut the doors of the vestibule and put out the lamps and have not burned incense or offered burnt offerings in the holy place to the God of Israel. You can see when you read that, it sounds like there is a tent inside the temple. So passages like this are what Friedman's noticing, like, what is that? Why do we get this language? Friedman also goes to several Psalms that appear to reference the temple and tabernacle together. So this one I'm going to read from the, let's see, I could probably just use the ESV for this. Oh Lord, I love the habitation of your house. Okay, I love the habitation of your house. This is Psalm 26:8. The word habitation there is not mishkan, it's me'on. Okay, oh Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. Now, the Jewish Publication Society has, oh Lord, I love your temple. There's the house, okay? Your temple abode, the habitation of your house, the ESV says, but here's the second line in the JPS, Jewish Publication Society Tanakh. And the dwelling place, the mishkan of your glory. That's actually literally what the Hebrew has. So I love your temple, okay? And then the temple is renamed in parallelism as the mishkan of your glory, the tabernacle of your glory. Again, it just sounds like referring to two things that are overlapping here. You know, you get other references like this in Psalm 43:3, Psalm 46:4, Psalm 132:7. Let me read that one. Psalm 132:7. Let us go to his, the Lord's dwelling place. Let us go to his mishkan, to his tabernacle. Let us worship at his footstool. Well, that's a reference to the ark, right? But wait a minute, this is Psalm 132. This is one of the songs of ascent. Songs of ascent are songs that you would sing at returning from exile, going up Mount Zion. You're going back home. What in the world is this? I mean, not only don't we have a temple in the post-exilic period, but when they're thinking about the place, they use mishkan and the ark, the footstool. Like, what's going on here? So I'm hoping you see that these are the kind of passages that Friedman has come across, in his study as an Old Testament scholar. He's like, boy, that sounds a little odd. Could it be that they actually, whatever the tent structure was, whether it was something David made, and so I don't have to affirm that Moses was real and all this, or again, me speaking, could it be that the original tabernacle was just reconstructed by David or something like that? But either way, that this thing, whatever it is moved inside the temple, and that's why you get this language. I mean, some of these verses are really kind of suggestive of that. So in Unseen Realm, I actually kind of like this idea. I think it does make sense to this, but ultimately it's going to come down to one or two things. So let's just transition here. You might ask, well, how in the world can anybody deny this? I mean, the verses look kind of clear. I mean, mishkan used in these late verses, and this is clearly the word in Exodus 26 and 27 for the structure of the tabernacle. And ohel is also used in some of these passages, and that would be the tent that's draped over the structure. It seems like the language is pretty clear. How can you object to this? Well, let me start with a few general ones, and then I'll get to Hurwitz, who really hates the idea. General objection number one, people will argue that Psalm references to the Mishkan aren't the tabernacle. They'll say the word is just being used to talk about God's dwelling place in general. It's generic. Okay? Okay, it's Mishkan, it's the same word, but that can't be really the tabernacle here. It just refers to a dwelling place, wherever that is and whatever that is. Two, they'd oppose Friedman on the textual issue in 1 Chronicles 17:5, tent to tent, tabernacle to tabernacle. And they would say, look, this alone says that the original tabernacle wasn't around. They're just, building whatever they can, making tents or whatever. So this place, this ark has some place to sit. It's not the real thing. Well, okay, that I guess it's at least fair, to go with one version of the text in 1 Chronicles 17:5 and to just say that the Mishkan references they're sort of metaphorical or they're generic. Okay, that's all well and good. You could sort of do that, but the reality is that doesn't address the idea that the Israelite priesthood used a tent structure for the ark and effectively, maybe a rebuilt tabernacle or something. They moved some kind of tent into the temple. That's really what Friedman's after. So you can say that again, some of this is generic or, again, metaphorical or whatever, but you still have other verses like the one where they open the doors, and then the references there to, to the tent and whatnot. It just, why even use the language? Why even use that kind of language? It would seem like the writer should have known that would just create confusion with the old, tabernacle. Why even use it? So we seem to be, kind of at a standstill, or at least that's the way generally, Friedman's argument is opposed. And this is why a lot of scholars say, well, that's okay. We'll think about it. We're not really persuaded, but yeah, let's think about it. What's the harm? Well, to Hurwitz, again, he just hates the idea. This has sort of been like a thing that gives him the way he writes. It's like, now I have some reason to get up in the morning so I can go attack Friedman's view. The main voice, again, who has no time at all for it, is Victor Avigdor Hurwitz, and he wrote an article called "The Form and Fate of the Tabernacle: Reflections on a Recent Proposal." It's from the Jewish Quarterly Review, 1995. So this is 15 years after, Friedman. His original article, it's a few years after the Anchor Bible Dictionary article, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to read you part of this, and you're going to see why I characterize Hurwitz the way I do. He writes this. Richard Elliott Friedman has argued that the Mosaic tabernacle, described by the Pentateuchal priestly source, stood in the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple. In order for the tabernacle, usually figured to be 10 cubits wide and 30 cubits long, to fit into a space 20 cubits square, Friedman has proposed a radical rearrangement of the tabernacle's components, thereby shrinking its measurements in comparison to standard reconstructions. Friedman's suggestions have met with a modicum of acceptance in scholarly literature, although the details of his argument have never been evaluated. The present article rejects absolutely every aspect of Friedman's proposal. A review of Exodus 25 through 40 reconfirms standard tabernacle reconstructions with some minor alterations. Detailed scrutiny of Friedman's argumentation shows that his innovative plan is based on numerous incorrect and impossible interpretations of crucial passages in the biblical text. The tabernacle proposed by Friedman is consequently completely without textual support. There is also no biblical evidence whatsoever that a tabernacle of any size or shape ever stood in the Holy of Holies in the temple. Post-biblical literature occasionally speculates about the whereabouts of the Mosaic tabernacle, and these speculations represent a topic worthy of future scholarly discussion. But these late musings, these recent musings, are products of exegetical questions raised by the extant form of the Bible and contribute nothing to the historical question of how the tabernacle was disposed of when the temple was built. Now, if you think that's snarky, he later says this. Friedman's reconstruction of the tabernacle is wrong in every detail, has not a shred of evidence in its support, does serious harm to an understanding of the structure and the text describing it, and reflects a total disregard for the most fundamental pillars of sound exegesis, and in particular, concern for the Hebrew language. That is brutal. Okay, and it's really unusually brutal. It's the kind of language that I have only seen in peer-reviewed literature in reviews of like pseudo-archaeology books. Like the stuff I would do on Paleobabble or Fringe Bop, where a scholar actually takes the time to read, some book like Ahmed Osman, Moses was, I don't know what I can't remember what his view is, but it's part of the Afrocentric, kind of thinking about the Exodus and whatnot. And when scholars actually get a hold of that stuff, and some of Graham Hancock's, books have been reviewed, they are just brutal. But I've never seen anybody be that brutal to someone who, Friedman has a degree from Harvard and he's well known and well published. This is really unusually brutal. So Hurwitz is really, this is pushing his buttons. He just hates it. So I'm going to at least summarize, the criticisms so you kind of know what he's so exercised about. First, he doesn't like the way Friedman understands the construction description of the tabernacle. Like he doesn't like the way Friedman interprets the construction language. And, it does run contrary to the consensus, but again, Hurwitz just sort of flips out over it. And second, he feels there's no textual evidence to support the idea of a tent inside the temple structure. He's going to take all of these passages, and I only read you a handful that sort of generate the question for Friedman. He's going to take all of them as metaphorical, just out of the gate. Now, another paragraph from Hurwitz, though, gives us a better feel, I think, for what's going on inside Hurwitz's head here. He writes, Friedman's revisions are not merely a barren academic exercise. There he goes again. All right, Friedman's revisions are not merely a barren academic exercise in what he jokingly calls cubit counting. Rather, they have weighty consequences in the realm of cultic history and source criticism. The reduction in size of the tabernacle enabled Friedman to make an even more surprising suggestion, namely that the tabernacle stood in the Holy of Holies of the first temple, under the extended wings of the cherubim, a space only 20 cubits deep and less than 10 cubits wide. This suggestion permitted him to propose an even further reaching hypothesis. In his opinion, certain biblical references to the temple, as if it were a tent or tabernacle, are not to be taken as metaphorical language. Dun, 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 dun. Like, how dare Friedman suggest that the Mishkan, again, even if it's something David built, was actually real? But instead, Hurwitz says, they actually refer to the real historical tabernacle. This is what Friedman's saying. Can you believe it? I mean, like this hysterical crescendo. He's actually saying that these references refer to the real historical tabernacle, which stood in the Holy of Holies from the days of Solomon until Jerusalem's destruction by the Babylonians. Only in this way, according to Friedman, would it be possible to carry out the priestly demand that sacrifice be performed at the entry of the tabernacle. There's that reference there to serving before the tent as each day required. So Hurwitz again, since the priestly source refers to and predicates its cultic regulations on a structure which existed in the time of the first temple but no longer exists in the post-exilic age, P, this is what he's really mad at, P must accordingly be pre-exilic. Well, so you have to realize J, E, D, P. P is last. That is the classic formulation of the documentary hypothesis. P must be exilic or post-exilic. How dare Friedman move the date of P to before the exile? How dare he do that? And we're forced to do that if he's right here. So this is what flips him out. And this might seem really, really arcane, and it kind of is. But this seems to suggest, again, what again really is pushing his buttons. It may sound trivial, but you have to realize that certain beliefs about the evolutionary progression of Israelite religion are tied to the presumed lateness of P. There's a reason why it's J, E, D, and P. Okay, there's stuff in P, the alleged P source, that surely must be later. Well, why must it be later, Mr. Scholar? Well, it has to be later because of what's going on theologically in P, because that's the kind of stuff that only like an enlightened, religious person would say or think. We can't have this early in Israel's history because Israel's religion evolved from primitive polytheism, to this crescendo moment of monotheism, and so P starts to sound, like it fits there, and it has these lofty religious ideas that surely the primitives wouldn't have come up with, and so P must be late. It must be last in the sources. And now, again, Friedman is a documentarian, but he's not married to the Wellhausen trajectory of the evolution of Israelite religion. And so he has committed the cardinal sin among source critics by moving P before the exile. That messes the whole picture up. This is why, incidentally, I did a paper at Regional SBL once on anthropomorphic language in P. I've actually, put this out on Amazon as a Kindle file. They don't want to hear that. They just don't want to hear that. There is anthropomorphic language in P, and so, well, anthropomorphism, making deities, like putting them as human figures, that's what primitives do, it's just like, that's how primitive people think about their gods, like as animals and as, partly humans or humans. And later on, we become more enlightened and we become, this is me talking now, but we become like deists. Like we have these loftier concepts of God and his transcendence and his distance and his wonder and his blah 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 blah. Like you put God on the earth, standing next, to Abraham or somebody. Well, that's the kind of thing that animists and polytheists would do, because they interact with their gods. But the more enlightened of us, no, the gods are, God is distant and superior and transcendent. And again, these ideas aren't compatible. Like this has to be an evolutionary arc in religious thinking. Honestly, this is really imposing modern Enlightenment conceptions on the Hebrew Bible. That's what Wellhausenism is. It really is. Defining like Elohim, plurality of Elohim, that must be polytheism. References to a divine council must be polytheism. Yeah, you only think that way because you're modern. Okay, even the term polytheism and monotheism are modern terms. And so you're retrojecting your own thought processes, your own worldview, your own way of thinking about things onto the Hebrew Bible, and then you're tearing it apart in its sources and then putting it together according to an evolution of religion. That's what the JEDP theory in its classical form actually does. And you all know me in this audience. I'm not a traditional Mosaic authorship guy. I'm what used to be called a supplementarian. I mean, Friedman is committed to a documentary view, of source criticism, but again, he's not buying the Wellhausen thing at this point, at least. And Hurwitz wants to beat him over the head with it. He's daring to tamper, with this wonderful trajectory, this evolutionary trajectory. So this is really what's driving the bus for him. Again, let's see. I'm going to find one other quote here. So again, you can see what's driving the bus here. Hurwitz actually says this in one paragraph. It seems clear that Friedman's desire to prove the relative antiquity of P led him to defend the historicity and continued existence of the tabernacle. So again, he's like, this is what Friedman's really doing. He wants so desperately, to mess with the Wellhausen reconstruction that he's looking for any way he can to take P and move it before the exile. Well, Friedman could just turn that sentence around and say this against Hurwitz. It seems clear that Professor Hurwitz's desire to prove the relative recency of P led him to deny the historicity and continued existence of the tabernacle. This is just tit for tat. This is what Hurwitz has here. He's got tit for tat. But again, it shows, what's really pushing his buttons. And for our purposes here, the real issue, again, is, are these references to the Mishkan linked in these temple passages, especially if they're exilic or post-exilic? That's pretty clear, like Psalms of Ascent. Are they real, or is this metaphorical language? That's really the issue. And rather than sort of, again, I think point out the obvious that Hurwitz has an axe to grind here. That's actually the more honest question that he raises and others raise. Do we have metaphorical language here? And so, toward proving Friedman wrong in this regard, when he finally gets to, instead of beating up Friedman and calling him a hack, okay, and calling him, God forbid, a defender of the antiquity of P, the cardinal sin here among source critics. When he gets past that and he starts talking about, is this metaphorical or not, Hurwitz, objects again to, the way Friedman handles the text. He doesn't like, again, some of the text critical decisions he makes. He doesn't like some of the way the way he translates certain words. Again, Friedman's translations are all within the semantic domain of a given word, but they're not the translations that Hurwitz prefers, because naturally Friedman's arguing his case. He translates a passage in a certain way to have it work with his thesis, basically showing that it can work. And Hurwitz just doesn't want to put up with that. So we get a little of this, again, tit for tat, or you say potato, I say potato, sort of, language. But when he actually gets to the Mishkan references, here's what Hurwitz writes, and this is kind of remarkable. He says, much of Friedman's evidence for the tabernacle in the temple thesis comes from the book of Chronicles. And again, he mentions the Psalms later too. It is curious that not a shred of evidence comes from the older book of Kings. So he's assuming Kings is older than Chronicles. Okay, well, that's fair. Not a shred of evidence comes from the older Book of Kings, since the chronicler clearly identifies the temple with the tabernacle in ways too numerous to detail here. There is no reason to assume that when he refers to the temple as Mishkan, he's doing anything else. In general, any independent statement of the chronicler must be assumed suspect, unless otherwise proven. So did you catch that? Since the chronicler clearly identifies the temple with the tabernacle, he actually admits this. The chronicler does do this. Like Friedman's examples, that does happen. But we have to view what the chronicler does with suspicion. Now, what's remarkable, again, from that point and from that point forward in Horowitz's article, is that he discusses none of the verses that I actually quoted in the episode that Friedman references in his article. Hurwitz doesn't address any of them. He doesn't specifically go into any of them. He only references one particular verse that I didn't include here, or that Friedman doesn't really do much with, Psalm 27:5. Friedman cited it, but he doesn't do anything with it. But this is the one that Hurwitz picks out. He will conceal me, for he will conceal me in his pavilion. The word there is sukkah, like the Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. Okay, so it's a little structure. He will conceal me in his sukkah in a day of trouble. He will hide me in the covert of his tent. The lemma there is ohel. So Hurwitz, again, there's not a whole lot in there. I mean, like I said, Friedman at least includes this as a reference in his article, but doesn't really develop it. But Hurwitz says this verse proves, at most, just the opposite of what Friedman wants to demonstrate. It is obvious that the entire temple and probably the courtyards are referred to here. Well, I just read the verse. That really isn't obvious. Does Friedman imagine that a person would take refuge in the Holy of Holies, which is where he claims the tabernacle stood? Now, that's actually a good question. Does Friedman imagine that a person would take refuge in the Holy of Holies, which is where he claims the tabernacle stood? The remaining verses adduced by Friedman are likewise misinterpreted and no more convincing. So what Hurwitz does is he pulls this one out, and he actually asks a good question. Does the psalmist really think that he can go into sacred space like this for protection? Again, that sounds pretty compelling, but there's actually a problem with it. True. I mean, no ordinary person, like unless you were a Levite sanctified to do this, no ordinary person would think of hiding in the holy place or Holy of Holies if they weren't allowed to. But here's the question. Would they even think the thought of a tent structure if there was no tent structure there in the first place? In other words, how does it even occur to the psalmist to use that language if there's no tent to be seen anyway? I mean, you could argue that the psalmist is just saying this to sort of, it's like heightened rhetoric. He wants to be near God or something like that because God's his protector. You could take the whole verse, Psalm 27:5 metaphorically, the way Hurwitz wants you to take everything else. But the real question is, why would you get the wording if there was no tent there anyway? So it seems like you could actually use Psalm 27:5 to argue Friedman's point. They wouldn't think of that unless that's what they're looking at. That's what they know is in there or they see. So where does this leave us? Well, for my part, as we wrap up here, I need, a better refutation of the passages that basically generate the whole discussion. The references that seem to refer to the temple as a tent or being accompanied by a tent or something like that, they seem like that's what they say. If we have a real tent referred to in these passages, if they can be taken at face value, then Friedman's alternate readings and the way he translates things and the way he constructs the tabernacle, that might be a good way to explain those verses. Friedman might be on the right path, because Friedman does take them seriously. It's like, well, to account for that, we got to take another look at Exodus 26 and 27 and see how the thing was constructed. Can it be constructed in such a way that it would fit in there to make sense of this? I mean, if these, again, later references that sort of mesh temple and tent, if they can be taken at face value, then what Friedman's trying to do is worth trying to do. Again, that's just where I'm at. So before I abandon Friedman's proposal, this is why I included it in Unseen Realm, before I abandon it, I'd like to have more certainty that there really is no tent in view at all. And I don't think Hurwitz supplies that. Yes, he brings up some things that, sure, you could read it, in a way different than Friedman does, and then that undermines Friedman's thesis. Sure, yeah, absolutely. You can do that. But the question is, must you? The question is, can Friedman's thesis work? And again, the real question, the bigger question is, do we need it or something like it to account for these references in later material when we have a temple for sure, or we did, and you still get this tent language? Should we take those at face value? If we're going to do that, then we need something like what Friedman is talking about. Either what he's saying, take it as workable, or something that works better. And I just don't think Hurwitz, for me anyway, has met that bar.